Hey, my name is Marco Sheppi. I don't know jack squat about cars. I'm not a mechanic. I'm not certified. I'm just a guy struggling his way through maintaining a couple of English sports cars, doing a terrible job at that. These videos are more for me to record exactly what I did so that when I look back and things break, I can figure out exactly what I did wrong. If you find them useful in any case, that's your fault. If you follow them, that's also your fault. Use it and follow at your own risk. Okay, this is a video for how to remove and replace the rear leaf springs on a early 70s MG Midget. This is more for my memory, so I don't forget how to do it. I have to do it a year from now. Basically, take the wheel off after jacking the car up. The jack mount point is pretty important. You don't want to put it on this plate here, or else you won't be able to get the leaf spring off. And the plan is essentially to remove 10 bolts and it all comes off. So under the car there's 4 bolts holding this plate in. You have to remove the entire plate. You can't just remove the spring from the plate. 2 bolts go up from the bottom and 2 bolts go down from the top through the cab in the back behind the seat. Then you need to remove these 2 bolts on this bracket here. These remove kind of a swing arm. And then finally, there are 4 bolts holding 4 nuts holding U-bolts with a bunch of brackets to the spring to the axle. Once those all come off, everything should just fall off and then you need to put a new one on. First step is to remove these 2 bolts from behind the seat. In this case I'm working on the passenger side. There's another one on the driver's side. If you slide the chair all the way forward and then put the back forward, you should be able to pull the carpet up and reveal these bolts. You can get at them with a 14mm deep socket and a pretty long extension with a breaker bar and then a socket wrench to finish it off. As a note, if your bolts have been in the car for 40 plus years like mine, you'll find that a 15mm may be good use of your time getting these out, as they've built up about 1 millimeter of gross grime. There you go. So yeah, it's just gross in general. 15mm will do the job. Okay, before going any further, after removing those 2 nuts, you're going to want to put something to hold the differential and axle. And this is a giant unibody differential. It's not independent suspension, it's one single piece. You want to make sure that you support the axle or the differential before pulling the suspension off, or else you'll only have this single rubber strap holding things in place. And let's just put it this way, rubber rots after a while. You don't want to depend on that as your source of support for your axle while you work on this. I have a jack stand. Just kind of lift the car up a little bit higher, get the jack stand in there, and just slowly bring it down just so it's lightly resting on it. If you don't, like I didn't yesterday, you can use something like a ramp or a box, something sturdy, either under the differential or under the axle, but away from these pieces here, is this what you'll be working on, to hold it up. Okay, so the last 2 bolts on the front side of the plate, which are towards the rear of the car, are again either 14-15mm depending on grime buildup. We'll just twist these off and the plate will kind of come free and just kind of sit in there. Alright, as you can see, the plate is free now. Just kind of hanging in there. It moves, it's kind of sitting in its position because the rest of the car is holding it in place. The next spot you want to turn your attention to is going to be these 4 bolts and nuts here on the bottom side. You want to detach those. Now I'm keeping my very bottom plate. As you'll notice, the dampener arm is bolted on here. If you're replacing this, now would be a good time to unscrew the dampener bolt. But my bottom plates seem to be in good condition, and I ordered 2 replacements and I can't find them, so they're going to stay on the car for now. Okay, so once you take all 4 bolts off, you'll be open with open threads and a bottom plate. Now, unless your car is exceptionally clean, you should be able to push down a little bit on here and get a little bit of leverage to loosen it up. You could also use a hitting stick and just kind of tap on this top piece here and in the exposed areas where you've got a piece of metal on that bottom plate that you can just kind of tap, kind of convince it down. This dampener arm will move, so as you push and get it out, the piece will come off the bottom like that. Inspect it, make sure there's no major damage or tear or rust through it. Again, this plate looks okay except for some discoloration on the surface, so I'm going to keep it until the next suspension change. And you'll just want to kind of lightly move this out of the way. Don't want to put too much weight on it or anything. Just get out of the way as you manipulate the suspension. Now, you'll have a couple more plates in here. Let's see if we can get a good view without the light distorting. So you've got a plate, then you've got rubber, then you've got spring, then rubber, then another plate. Then you've got these two U-bolts up here that run through the top, and a plate it rests on. All this looks like crap because the previous owner, as you can see, kind of aggressively undersprayed the car. So the car's not rusting, but everything's basically caked in an inch of black crap. So again, with a hammer you'll want to coax each of these plates off until you can liberate the suspension from the U-bolts. And then just take the U-bolts out and make sure you don't lose this plate unless you have a replacement for it. You'll need it during reinstallation. Okay, so after just some light tapping, you've got two plates, two rubbers, and you can see these were replaced in August of 2014. It is April of 2016, so they're not in there very long, but even in that time, the plates are pretty fucking gross looking. And the rubbers are just tore up. The U-bolts look worse for wear. Everything's just kind of gross in general. Now I don't know how much of the suspension was replaced in August, unfortunately. I'm not sure if it was just the springs or all the equipment, but we're going to go with all new equipment, all new bolts, all new nuts and washers and springs. But you can see it's not been that old. The original sticker's still on it. So thanks, Moz. You produced a quality pair of leaf springs that lasted me just shy of a year. While we're here, we'll replace this guy up here. See this rubber bumper? It's a little cracked. The one on the other side, which has since been replaced, you can kind of see it way back there. It's all nice and new looking. That was like demolished. This thing is used to keep the axle from hitting the top of your car. See how it's nice and smooth up there? Several times I've bottomed out because of my lack of nice and tight suspension. You can also see a lot of the cracking here on the band. This band is designed to do the exact opposite. Make sure the suspension doesn't leave the car too much. So between the two, it keeps the car body from going too high or too low and crashing into the axle. You want to make sure you inspect and replace these as needed. I'm going to keep the strap here for now. It looks to be in pretty decent condition, but this rubber thing is cracked. I'm going to go ahead and get rid of it. To do so, let's put this light somewhere. Whatever, stupid light. To do so, freaking light. Pull the old thing off. Old, gross, cracked, new hotness. Now, I may have inadvertently installed this on the wrong side on the car. It's actually upside down over there. I don't think that matters. Basically, it's a plug with enough force you can get it on there. The thing is this hole is way smaller than that plug, whereas this side is much more accommodating. So I'm not sure if this is just a piece that Moss made to kind of satisfy different year cars, but I'm doing it this way because it does require a lot of effort, and some. Okay, after several inappropriate jokes and enough pushing, I've gotten this rubber bumper onto the little plug there. We use a little bit of dish soap. You don't want to use oil for fear of drying out the rubber. So a little bit of mild dish detergent as a lubricant, essentially, to get it onto there. So you see it just kind of sits flush there. It's definitely stuck in there pretty good. This is also a good time to take a break. We just have a couple more things back here to get off, but take a look around the inside of your car. You don't get this chance very often unless you're changing a tire. Make sure your fuel pump is secured. Mine's actually slid over a little bit. You can see where it's used to rest. So I'm going to go re-bolt that in there since this is kind of a makeshift fuel pump holder. Check your brake lines for any leaking. Mine, very little amount there, but I can't tell if that's from the differential or from the brake lines. I don't know which one's worse, to be honest. Fuel lines look good. No electrical lines hanging, no obvious shorts. Check your drive shaft, make sure there's no loose nuts or bolts missing, nothing chipped or broken. Kind of general things you want to look for while you're driving. You don't want to have surprises on the road. Okay, now it's time for the last two nuts that hold on this kind of L bracket, which acts as like a swinging arm back here. Lots of suspension to sway and stuff without breaking or bending the leaf spring too much. So these come off pretty straightforward. It's just, you know, pull righty tighty lefty loosey. Again, these are 4mm typically, but with all the grime, 15mm works better. You'll want to turn it as you normally would. You'll notice the whole bracket will go. Just go until you have enough resistance. Usually that's when you push up against the bottom here to get it loosened. Now, I have the unfortunate joy of having this line in the way here. I think this is the breather for the gas tank. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put something here to prevent it from going up and riding up too high. Alternatively, you could try tackling this bolt first, which won't need as much turning and coaxing, in hopes to get this one loosened as well. Anyways, we'll get back in a second to see how it works out. Okay, after turning the wrench the right way, both come off pretty easily. As you see, this thing will rotate in the direction you're turning it, and eventually you'll get enough resistance that it'll just kind of start unscrewing the nuts. Once you get off, the plate will be stiff as well. Again, some light coercion with a hammer will make that easier. Finally, you just got to kind of wrestle the spring out of here. Should be pretty well greased up, and that's it. The spring is now removed. Just move this up past the gas tank on the other side, and then with some light persuasion from a hammer, or if you got enough force with your fingertips, push it out the other side. This should finish liberating the spring. It should be separated from the body, just kind of laying. And now we'll go prep the other spring. So the next part, now you get the spring off the car, is to install the new bracket or the old one. I recommend putting a new one on though, to the joint here. So each spring will have two sides, one that has a very small opening and one with a much bigger opening. Smaller opening with a bolt. Orient the plate, screw it through and bolt it on. Make sure you leave even clearance between both sides so that it freely swings. As you can see here, these weren't quite properly installed or shifted later on and have worn down the side and actually snag and catch. Not good for suspension. So, once you've got it installed and freely opened, go ahead and move it to the car and we can start bolting it in. Okay, so now that you got the backing plate onto your suspension here, you're going to want to attach it back into the well here. To do so, basically, take the plate and the spring, align it up, and then put the two bottom bolts in first. Don't tighten them all the way, just get it in there pretty snug so it'll hold itself up so that you can feed the top bolts down next and get it all nice and aligned. Once those are in, tighten them up. First the bottom ones all the way, then the top ones, and double check the bottom ones one more time to make sure everything is tight, tight, tight. Okay, so again, just to recap here, between the seam, you'll find the holes. I've pushed the two bolts down. I used the smaller, the 14mm, the one that was kind of hard to get on. If the holes are aligned perfectly, the little bit of down pressure, you'll be able to get the thread to start. If the holes aren't aligned perfectly, which shouldn't happen if you kind of hand tighten snug the bottom two bolts in, you'll need to go realign them again. Once I get it in there, you can use the regular ratchet to get it on down there. And then what you want to do is take your breaker bar and just kind of finish it. Okay, just come back down to the underside. Using the breaker bar and the 15mm socket head, I went ahead and tightened up the bottom ones. Surprisingly enough, they were loose. So these are nice and snug. If you want to, give it another double check on the top side. Make sure you haven't gained a couple of little inches. I've used locking washers and I really hand crank those suckers down. I think they're going to be okay, but I'm still going to double check them after this video. The next step, counter to the removal process, is not to attach the spring to the axle, but to attach the spring to the hinge back up here, the one that was kind of a pain in the butt to get off. So that'll be the next step. I'll walk you through that process in just a second. Then once that's aligned, one thing I want to make a note of is it'll eventually be resting here on this bracket. You generally don't want to do that for too long or too much because that could put too much stress on the dampener. Seems like a funny idea, I know, but best to err on the side of safety. Alright, so the next step's going to require these 4 kind of rubber gaskets, the weird shackle and plate, and then a 3/8 inch 24 fine thread nylock bolts, nuts, not bolts. Now I managed to order not enough. So in substitution I've got just the standard 3/8 fine threaded, 24 fine thread nuts and some 242 blue Loctite. This is the 10-minute set, kind of automotive approved use case Loctite. It's great to have around in general, so I'm going to use that in lieu of the nylock nuts. Definitely recommend use the nylock nuts. Order enough. The Moz website recommends 8 for this build. That's just for the U-bolts though. You'll want to order 2 more per side, so another set of 4 for 12 total. Otherwise you'll have to resort to these. So basically we're going to take the shackle and the neoprene rubber and kind of push it through this side. Now the original, or the previous person that did the replacement here, put the shackle in through this way, which kind of has not a lot of clearance near the gas tank. I am going to reproduce this simply for the sake of completeness. I wish this camera would focus a little better. Focus. Focus. There we go. But you could very well have come through this way and simply apply the nut over there. However, I think going with the completeness of what I did the other side, which is shackle on the inside of the car, nut on the outside, that's the approach I'm going to take. To do that, you'll need to insert both. See how hard I'm even getting it out. I haven't tried to install it yet. You'll need to install the rubber on the shackle. Now, these don't want to go in very well. They are snug, 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 snug. Super snug. Even now, with my one hand, I can't really get it in there without applying a bit of pressure. I'm going to be using some mild detergent to lubricate both the inside shackle and the outside here to avoid using any kind of oil or something that would dry out the rubber and further degrade it quicker. That should be enough to get it in there. Okay, honestly, this is going to be the hardest part of the rebuild, is getting the bracket mounted up there. So you can see it definitely does not look pretty or perfect at all. What I've done is dish soap on the inside and outside, coax them in enough to get the thread out. Now that the thread's out, I can kind of keep coaxing the rubber in as I also apply the plate and bolt. So by putting the nut and the bolt and the plate in, I'll be able to squeeze these together to finally marry them. So I'm going to lubricate the bottom side. That's going to be fed through here, the wide hole end of it. One rubber on each side, and then the plate plus the nuts, a little bit of thread lock, and that'll conclude this. Now to do that, you'll want to lift the bar up and over the bracket here. So both will kind of give a little bit. You just kind of swing it and coax it on up over there so you can attach it. Okay, with the worst behind us now, I was able to get the majority of the gasket, what's that rubber thing? It's not a gasket. Anyways, I got the majority of that thing into each side, and then I used a washer actually, just a really big oversized washer, and the nut, because I couldn't get the plate threaded. Threaded it, finally got enough of the rubber on to get the plate. Kind of went back and forth, evenly applying every couple strokes, going back and forth between each nut to get them in there. That compresses the rubber into each of the slots, and then backed out each nut individually, applied a little bit of blue Loctite to finish up the job. So those will hold there. Finally, the last piece is to get the U-joint, the U-bolts, and then the plates in the bottom bracket. For this, attach to the axle, place the wheel on, and see if the car stands on its own. Alright, so I started the installation process here. Basically, I put the U-bolt plate back in here, this one. Now, I didn't replace this one. Given the life expectancy of this set of Moz motor springs, I'll be replacing these again probably at the winter time. So I'm not too worried about this, but you put either a new one or the existing one back on, thread the U-bolts down, and then what you want to do is place a plate and a piece of rubber. These all kind of line up, and I just kind of pushed them through the U-bolt. So this will go all the way up here once finished, and this rubber will then be met and married here with the brace between it. Now what we're going to do is repeat the same process down here, rubber, plate, and then finally this pedestal to create the sandwich, and then we'll make sure that we pull this up and over this little bolt down here. Once that's up and over and everything's in here, we will move on to the next step. Okay, so here's the next obstacle. As you can see, I've got the bolt threaded through the bottom here. I've got the rubber and the plate proper positions. Rubber and plate up here. But I need to get these U-bolts through the hole here. What we're going to do is we're going to use a second jack to press up on the entire unit here, which will marry the suspension by pushing it out this way. So once under load, this bracket will actually sit further back the way it was designed to be sitting, and we'll push it up until we marry it here with the rest of the axle. I'm going to go get that in place and come back once we got that realigned. Alright, so there's a couple things to note here. Now I've aligned the screw, or bolt rather. Can't quite see it here, but there's a bolt that comes out the bottom of these. I've aligned that dead center with this really small, cheap, it's like a 2-ton little lift from Advanced Auto, something cheap and small I had to pick up yesterday because I didn't have one. What I'm doing is, as I apply pressure, the entire suspension comes up and meets closer to those U-bolts. Now as you do this, because the suspension is going to be pulled back a little bit, not as normal state, the more you bring it up, the more it'll come into position where it should be. It's going to push these U-bolts up. You want to make sure that they don't go up very far, or else they'll get stuck, and you'll have to back everything down and try again. So, just because of the nature of it, by having this plate in here, it's going to kind of create a lot of tension. Just kind of keep jiggling them every couple of increments. Shake the piece down here, make sure this isn't binding anywhere. You don't want anything getting pinched and stuff. You want them nice and flat and level with the brace that's on there, and you make sure this stays oriented up. Cool. So looks like we're pretty close. Just needs a couple more pumps, so that we can start threading the bolt holes in. As we get closer, we'll want to stop and keep trying to make sure those guide in. As you can see, it looks like they're going to miss by a couple millimeters, but the closer we get, the more aligned they'll become. Just make sure you guide them in so that they kind of meet and greet nicely. Okay, so I've kept applying even pressure. What you'll find is the bolts on the front of the connection here are going to protrude much sooner than the ones in the back. So make sure as you're going up and down, and be gentle, be slow with the process. Took me a couple up and downs to get everything aligned right. The plate also is very manipulatable, so you can get in there, you can wiggle it around and move it with relative levels of ease in order to get it to coax into place. So I've got enough of all the threads. If I push up a little bit, I got enough threads that I can start all 4 of the nuts. Once you're at that stage, and you notice there's enough pressure to lift it off the jack stand, the axle's being rested on top of here now, and ultimately will be connected to the suspension to hold it. Once you're at this phase, get your 3 1/8 inch 24 fine thread count nylock nuts and start getting them threaded and on. And then once you get them threaded and on, go ahead and start tightening them pretty evenly, and what I do is I'll start kind of in a star pattern, the same way you tighten the wheels. One here, then across in the back and the front here, then come over to here, and then finally here. And do about 4 or 5 turns on each. The idea is that you want to bring this up the plate evenly so you get no pinching or binding, and it'll make it ultimately easier in the long run, though it's a little bit of work up front. You also want to make sure, as you're joining the plates, the rubbers are aligned here. Whenever the video focuses. So you want to make sure that the rubbers aren't being pinched. They're properly in the little guide channels here. See, the top one's resting in there pretty nicely. No pinching or anything of that is occurring. And it's mated pretty well with the top one, the top plate. And the top plate is properly nested inside the bottom of the axle bracket. So you want to do that all the way around. Make sure everything's kind of aligned. Take your time. You'll find it'll fly in about 15 minutes time. Everything will be kind of buttoned up and you'll be putting the wheel on and done. But don't get exit fever being the last thing and rush through and miss something potentially damaging to the car's lifespan. Alright, I went ahead and threaded as many of the nuts as I can. They're just hand tight. They're just making sure that there's enough thread. I'm basically up to the part where the nylon starts to kick in. The problem is the jack wasn't perfectly positioned in the middle. I'm not able to thread the last one here. So what you're going to want to do, if this happens to you, and it's happened to me on both sides so far, is just get as many nuts as you can on, at least 3. If you don't have 3, stop, take the jack down, redo it again. Seems like a pain in the butt, but you risk stressing the nuts and the bolts. If you get 3 on though, it's pretty safe to go ahead and just back the jack down a little bit, slide it over to the left, the right, forward or backwards, depending on where it is, to recenter it. If you can't, if the head of your jack is too big, get a piece of wood that's pretty thin, something that you can nestle in its place to kind of offset the jack top from there. That way you can keep the pressure up. And finally, if you can't get it in there at all, but you got 3 of the nuts on, just back it down, put the 4th nut on, and then start tightening. It'll be easier if you can push the pressure off it with the jack. That way you're not stressing the nuts as you tighten. But, I mean, worst case scenario, that's something else you could do as well. I'm going to go ahead and move this, get them tightened up, and I'll meet you as soon as I get to the very top of these. Alright, so I went ahead and pulled the jack down. You can see that middle kind of thread nut bolt. That comes on the spring, so don't worry about that one. But the 4 other ones, the bolts, the U-bolts, and their corresponding, again, nylock bolt nuts. Ugh, it's been a long day. You can see here, a lot of the rubber is pinching. Honestly, I couldn't tell if that's the right way or not. I basically torqued these until they all are about equally tight, and they're pretty tight in there. I'm going to finish them off with a 1/4 turn using the breaker bar just to make sure they're tight enough. The way I found them was like this, essentially squeezed and pushed out. In my opinion, it seems like the right idea. You want to mate the rubber to the plates. They're there to kind of absorb vibrations, but not too loose that they actually are vibrating. I'm going to look up later on and find out this is exactly how tight they should be, if they should be backed out a little bit. I can see the case for both, where they just fit perfectly in there, and there's just everything's nice and tight and humming along. But I can also see where you want to make sure it's really wrenched in and really secure and gripped. So 1/4 turn on these with the breaker bar and the 14 long socket, and then that's it. What I'll do is I will go over each and every single nut and bolt one more time, make sure everything's tight. It's cheap to check now, it's expensive to find out later. So that's kind of the thing you want to go to, especially attacking this from a home amateur mechanic standpoint, is just double check everything. Everything's tight, everything's right, everything's new, everything's in place. It does not cost much or afford you much to double check those things. You also want to make sure that things like this plate here is oriented up, that the U bolts are within the flange inside of there, It'd be hard to get them outside, but I imagine someone might find a way. And that they all thread through carefully here. There's no binding. I mean, this seems like it might be a concern. Again, I'm going to look that up later. But when you touch it, you feel it. It's like it's just solid, straight rubber. And I can see that being the case where you just want to squeeze the living daylights out of that. That's it otherwise. You want to also make sure you check the bushings back here. That they're all properly seated and in, and nothing major flawed back there. The nylon bushing's the one that were a pain in the butt to get in. And that everything's up here is aligned. You see that the bar sits right between the two mount points. There won't be any binding or rubbing when the wheel comes into play, which is super important. You don't want that where you can damage the suspension and shorten its lifespan. Other than that, that's it. I'm going to button the wheel up and then do check in with everyone in a couple minutes. Okay, so the wheel's on. Everything looks good. What you'll want to do is, now that everything's on and situated, go ahead and peek your head up under the car. Make sure that there's no rubbing or binding, that this leaf spring runs straight and true to the back. There's nothing being caught or weird positions, or anything that seems out of place. And once you've done that, go ahead and fire it up and take it out for a short trip. I recommend incrementally longer trips through various terrain to prevent, don't go on a 100 and 200 mile drive after you put new suspension in. It may be tempting, but you want to make sure there's plenty of time for it to wear and settle in. And then after each successive try, go ahead and pop underneath the car. If you have to, jack it up, take the wheel off if you can't reach the bolts. And just make sure they're all still tight and snug and everything's where you left it. Make sure nothing's fallen off or gotten loose in that process as everything's settling. That's it otherwise. That's essentially what you need to change the suspension on an MG Midget, and I imagine most other half-elliptical leaf spring vehicles. Cheers.